I'm taking half your millions, including your grandmother's estate, Mitchell announced with a smug grin, his voice echoing through the courtroom like he was announcing lottery numbers. The absolute confidence in his tone made my stomach turn, a nauseating mix of anger and disbelief. I forced myself to remain perfectly still in my seat at the defendant's table, my hands clasped so tightly in my lap that my knuckles were white. My name is Carolyn Pierce. I'm 45 years old, and I never in my wildest nightmares imagined I'd be sitting in a divorce court in Nashville, Tennessee, watching the man I had loved for 5 years attempt to steal everything I'd ever worked for, everything my family had ever worked for. Mitchell sat across the room with his attorney, Arthur Finch, looking for all the world like he'd already won. His expensive suit, one I'd paid for, of course, was perfectly pressed, and his sandy blonde hair was slicked back in that way that used to charm me, but now just made me sick to my stomach. It was the look of a predator who had cornered his prey. Your Honor, Arthur Finch continued, his voice smooth and practiced, my client is entitled to half of all marital assets. This, of course, includes the substantial inheritance Mrs. Pierce received from her grandmother's estate during the course of their marriage. His briefcase was stuffed with documents, each one a weapon in his arsenal, all of them outlining exactly how Mitchell planned to walk away with my grandmother's hard-earned money. I could feel the eyes of the courtroom spectators on me. They leaned forward in their seats, clearly fascinated by what they assumed would be a massive, messy, multi-million-dollar divorce settlement. Some of them were probably doing the math in their heads, wondering what it would feel like to get a windfall like that. A few reporters had even shown up, their pens scratching away in their notebooks, drawn by the whispers of a prominent Nashville businesswoman being taken to the cleaners by her charming husband. Judge Albright, a stern woman in her 60s with steel gray hair and an expression that suggested she'd seen it all, reviewed the initial paperwork. Her face was a neutral mask. She'd been presiding over family court for over 20 years, and I imagined she'd seen every dirty trick in the book. But I had a feeling she hadn't seen what I was about to reveal. Mitchell turned slightly in his chair, just enough to flash me what he probably thought was a victorious smile. The sheer audacity of it made my blood boil. This was the same man who used to bring me coffee in bed every morning, who claimed he loved me for who I was, not for what I had in the bank. 5 years of marriage. 5 years of my life, my trust, and my heart, and it had all been a lie. A calculated, long-term investment for him. The courtroom felt oppressive, suffocating with its dark wood paneling and the heavy weight of legal proceedings hanging in the air. Outside, I could hear the distant sounds of Nashville traffic, a constant reminder of a world that was still moving. People were going about their normal lives while mine was being dissected and picked apart in front of a room full of strangers. I clutched my purse tighter, feeling the reassuring stiffness of the envelope inside. The envelope that would change everything. Mrs. Pierce, Judge Albright addressed me directly, her voice cutting through the murmurs of the room. Do you have any response to these claims? I stood up slowly, my heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. But beneath the fear, my resolve was stronger than ever. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. The moment when Mitchell's greed would finally, publicly, catch up with him. Yes, Your Honor, I said, my voice steady. I believe there's something the court needs to see. Looking back, I should have seen the warning signs. Lord knows, they were there, flashing like bright red neon lights, but I was too blind to see them. Or maybe, I just didn't want to. I met Mitchell during a particularly vulnerable time in my life. I'd just turned 40, and while I was running my own consulting firm, Pierce Analytics, with modest success, I had almost no time for romance. My grandmother had been my closest companion, my rock, until her death 3 years before I met Mitchell. I was still grieving her loss when he appeared like a mirage at a business conference in Memphis. He was everything I thought I wanted. He was charming, attentive, and seemed genuinely fascinated by my work helping small businesses optimize their operations. He'd listen for hours as I talked about spreadsheets and profit margins, his eyes never leaving my face. You're brilliant, Carolyn, he'd say, watching me review financial reports on my laptop in the hotel lounge. I've never met anyone who understands numbers the way you do. At the time, I thought he was impressed by my intelligence, my passion for my work. My heart would flutter, and I'd feel a warmth spread through my chest. Now, I realize he wasn't admiring my mind, he was calculating my net worth. Our courtship was a whirlwind. It was a blur of expensive dinners at restaurants I could barely pronounce, romantic weekend getaways to quaint little towns, and flowers delivered to my office for no reason at all. Mitchell worked as a sales manager for a pharmaceutical company, a good job with a decent salary, but he always seemed to have an endless supply of money for these lavish dates. When I questioned his spending, a little worried about his finances, he'd just laugh it off. "I believe in investing in the people I care about," he'd say, taking my hand and kissing my knuckles. And I, like a fool, was flattered by his attention and his generosity. I didn't realize I wasn't a person he was investing in, I was the investment itself. He was planning his long-term strategy, and I was the prize. The truth is, I was lonely. I had spent my 30s building my business from the ground up. It was my baby, but it was a demanding one. It left little room for anything else. My friends were all married with kids, their lives full of school plays and soccer practice. My life was full of balance sheets and client meetings. Mitchell filled a void I didn't even want to admit existed. He brought excitement and companionship into my life, and I was so grateful for it that I ignored the little voice in the back of my head, the one that sounded an awful lot like my grandmother, telling me to slow down. He was so smooth, so polished. He knew exactly what to say, exactly when to say it. He made me feel seen, appreciated, and for the first time in a long time, truly cherished. He told me I deserved to be spoiled, that I worked too hard and needed someone to take care of me. And I soaked it all up like a sponge. He was laying the groundwork, brick by brick, building a foundation of trust and affection that he planned to cash in on later. He played the part of the perfect partner so convincingly that I never once suspected it was all just a performance. A performance for an audience of one, designed to win my trust, my hand in marriage, and ultimately, my future inheritance. Looking back now, from the cold, hard reality of this courtroom, it's all so painfully clear. He wasn't just charming, he was a predator. And I had walked right into his trap. When Mitchell proposed after only 8 months, a part of me was hesitant. I could hear my grandmother's voice in my head, clear as day, warning me about men who move too fast, men whose charm is a little too perfect. A man in that much of a hurry is usually running from something, or running towards something that isn't yours, she used to say. But Mitchell was persistent. He was an expert at making his impatience sound like romantic devotion. "Life's too short to wait, Carolyn," he insisted, his eyes full of what I mistook for sincerity. "I know what I want, and I want you. Why waste another day?" His proposal was something out of a movie. It was elaborate, meticulously planned. A private dinner on a riverboat, gliding down the Cumberland River at sunset. There was even a string quartet playing our favorite songs. The ring was stunning, a massive diamond that probably cost more than his annual salary, though I didn't think about that at the time. I was too caught up in the moment, in the fantasy he had so skillfully crafted for me. I said yes. A few weeks later, my lawyer, Susan Vance, sat me down in her office. Susan was practical, no nonsense, and had been handling my business contracts for years. "Carolyn, we need to talk about a prenuptial agreement," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Any successful businesswoman needs protection. It's not romantic, I know, but it's practical." I felt a knot of anxiety tighten in my stomach. I felt awkward and almost ashamed to bring it up with Mitchell. I was worried he'd think I didn't trust him, or that I was more focused on my money than our love. It felt so cynical, so transactional. But Susan was firm. "This isn't about trust, it's about clarity. It protects both of you." So, that evening, over dinner, I broached the subject as gently as I could. I stumbled over my words, trying to explain that it was just a legal precaution, something my lawyer insisted on. To my complete surprise, Mitchell's reaction was the opposite of what I'd feared. He laughed. A big, hearty laugh, as if I'd told the funniest joke in the world. He waved it off like it was nothing more than a pesky fly. Of course, darling. Whatever makes you comfortable, he said, reaching across the table to cover my hand with his. I'm not marrying you for your money. I'm marrying you for you. A piece of paper doesn't change that. He made it seem so simple, so unimportant. He signed the papers a few days later in Susan's office without even reading them. I watched as he just scrawled his signature on the last page, joking with the notary that love doesn't need fine print. His casual, almost dismissive attitude completely convinced me that my worries were unfounded. He was so understanding, so willing to put my concerns at ease. It's just a romantic formality, he'd said, scribbling his signature with a flourish, as if he were signing a guestbook instead of a legally binding document. I remember feeling a profound sense of relief. I had found a man who truly loved me for me. Susan had been incredibly thorough in crafting the agreement. It was an ironclad document. It protected not just my existing assets and my business, but it had specific clauses about any future inheritance or significant business growth. Your grandmother's estate will eventually come to you, she'd reminded me during one of our meetings. This ensures it stays in your family, where it belongs. At the time, I honestly thought she was being overly cautious. I thought there was no way I would ever need it. Now, sitting in that courtroom, I realized she hadn't been cautious. She'd been prescient. She had seen the predator that I had been blind to. And that document, the one Mitchell had signed with a careless laugh, was the only thing standing between my family's legacy and his insatiable greed. For the first year and a half of our marriage, things were fine. They were normal. We settled into a routine. I ran my business, Mitchell went to his sales job. We hosted dinner parties, went on vacations. It felt like the life I was supposed to be living. I had convinced myself that the nagging little voice of doubt in my head was just my own insecurity. Mitchell was a wonderful husband, supportive and loving. The illusion was perfect. And then, the phone call came. It was from the lawyer handling my grandmother's estate. She had passed away peacefully in her sleep. The grief was immediate and overwhelming, a fresh wave of the sadness I thought I had learned to live with. But then the lawyer started talking about the will, and my grief was joined by a sense of absolute shock. My grandmother had left me everything. Her beautiful house in the countryside, her extensive investment portfolio, her priceless collection of rare books, and the number that made me drop the phone, $2.8 million in carefully managed funds. It was far more than I had ever expected. The inheritance transformed my financial situation overnight. I went from being a comfortable, successful business owner to being genuinely wealthy. After I hung up the phone, I sat in stunned silence for a long time. When Mitchell came home from work, I told him the news, my voice still trembling. And his reaction, though I missed the full significance of it at the time, was telling. His eyes, they literally lit up. It wasn't a look of sympathy for my loss, or even shared joy for our newfound security. It was a look of pure, unadulterated avarice. A flicker of something cold and calculating passed through them before he masked it with a performance of excitement. $2.8 million, he repeated, the number rolling off his tongue as if he were tasting something exquisite. He grabbed me by the shoulders, his grip a little too tight. Carolyn, he said, his voice breathless. Carolyn, we're rich. The way he said we're. It should have been my first clue. It wasn't wow, your grandmother was so generous, or this will give you so much security. It was we're rich. As if his name was on the will, too. As if her life's work now belonged to him. From that moment forward, everything changed. It wasn't an overnight shift, but a gradual, insidious transformation. The charming, supportive husband began to fade, and in his place emerged a man I barely recognized. A man who saw my inheritance not as a blessing or a legacy, but as his own personal lottery ticket. The money that my grandmother had so carefully saved and invested, the money that represented a lifetime of her hard work and frugal living, had just painted a giant target on my back. And the man sleeping next to me every night was the one holding the bow and arrow. The phone call that had brought me both sorrow and shock had also unknowingly started a ticking clock on my marriage. The fuse had been lit. It was only a matter of time before Mitchell's greed would cause everything to explode. The change in Mitchell was dramatic. Within 6 months of the inheritance clearing, he quit his job. He framed it as a noble sacrifice. "I want to explore new opportunities," he announced over a lavish dinner he'd ordered in. "And more importantly, I want to be here to support your success. You're the real star, Carolyn. I just want to be your biggest cheerleader." It sounded wonderful. Supportive. Loving. But what he actually did was spend my money like it was his own personal, bottomless allowance. His new opportunities consisted of finding new and creative ways to burn through my grandmother's legacy. It started with a car. A brand new, top-of-the-line luxury sedan. He claimed it was for networking purposes, that he needed to project an image of success to attract investors for his vague, non-existent business ideas. Then came the investment. A friend of his was opening a trendy new restaurant downtown. Mitchell, without consulting me, without even mentioning it until the check had been written, threw $30,000 of my inheritance into the venture. He fancied himself a savvy investor, a restaurant mogul in the making. The business failed within a year, and the $30,000 simply vanished. When I tried to talk to him about it, my voice laced with panic, he became defensive. "You have to risk money to make money, Carolyn. It's business. You, of all people, should understand that." He booked expensive, spontaneous vacations, first-class flights to Europe, 5-star resorts in the Caribbean. He joined the most exclusive golf and country club in Nashville, a place with a waiting list years long and an astronomical membership fee. His wardrobe suddenly rivaled that of a movie star. He started dressing like he'd been born into wealth, not like he'd married into it. Every time I questioned a purchase, every time I tried to gently suggest we needed a budget or should talk about these major financial decisions, he would turn it back on me. He'd use a soft, patronizing tone. "Sweetheart, we're partners. Couples should trust each other with financial decisions. Are you saying you don't trust me?" He made me feel like I was being controlling, like I was the one with the problem. He was a master manipulator, twisting my valid concerns into an attack on his character and our marriage. He was systematically isolating my inheritance, turning my money into our money in his mind and in his actions. He was living a life he had never earned, all while claiming he was doing it for us. The man I married, the charming pharmaceutical sales manager, was gone. In his place was this caricature of a wealthy playboy, a man whose entire identity was now wrapped up in the money my grandmother had left me. I was no longer his wife, I was his bank. And it was becoming terrifyingly clear that this bank had a very loose withdrawal policy, and he was the only one with the card. The life he was building for himself was a house of cards, and it was built on a foundation of my family's money. I was just beginning to realize that when it all came crashing down, I'd be the one buried in the rubble. The breaking point, the moment the illusion shattered into a million irreparable pieces, came about 6 months ago. I was at a charity luncheon at the country club when I overheard one of the other members talking. Mitchell was telling us the most fascinating story about his family's timber business, she said. It's amazing how that inheritance has allowed him to really step into his own as an investor. I felt the blood drain from my face. His family's timber business? His inheritance? He had been telling people at the club that the money, my grandmother's money, was family money that belonged to both of us, a shared legacy. He'd started introducing himself as an investor and entrepreneur, conveniently forgetting to mention that all his investments were made with my grandmother's carefully preserved wealth. He was rewriting our history, erasing my family's contribution and inserting himself into the narrative as the self-made man of leisure. That evening, I confronted him. The moment he walked in the door, I didn't even let him take his coat off. "What is this I hear about your family's timber business, Mitchell?" For a second, he looked confused. Then, a flicker of panic, quickly masked by his usual defensiveness. He became cruel. "Oh, what's the matter, Carolyn?" he sneered. "You act like it's some big secret that I married up. Everyone knows you needed someone like me to show you how to enjoy life." His words were like daggers. "Before we met, you were just a lonely workaholic with no social life. I gave you a life. This money just makes it a better one." His words cut deep because there was a tiny, horrible grain of truth in them. I had been lonely. And he had brought excitement and companionship into my life. But I realized in that sickening moment that it had all been a long game. He had positioned himself as my savior while systematically planning to claim everything I had. He hadn't just married me, he had targeted me. The final, definitive straw came a week later. I was using our shared home computer to look up a recipe when I saw his email was still open. I know I shouldn't have looked, but a gut feeling, a cold dread, compelled me. And there it was. A chain of emails between Mitchell and his now lawyer, Arthur Finch. They'd been planning this for months. It was all there, in black and white. Discussions about divorce strategy, about timing it to maximize his potential settlement. Mitchell had even been researching Tennessee's divorce laws, looking for loopholes, for ways to claim that his emotional support and lifestyle contributions entitled him to a larger share of my assets. They were building a case that his presence in my life was a form of labor that now required payment for my inheritance. I felt a hot flash crawl up my neck. I wasn't just being used, I was being methodically dismantled. My husband was plotting to leave me and take half of my grandmother's legacy with him. That's when the grief and the hurt finally burned away, leaving behind something cold, hard, and sharp, fury. The very next morning, I called Susan Vance. "Susan," I said, my voice devoid of any emotion. "He's planning to divorce me. I want to file first. I refuse to let Mitchell control the narrative or the timeline any longer. If he wanted a fight over my grandmother's money, I'd give him one. But it sure as hell wouldn't go the way he expected." The game was on, and I was finally ready to play. And so, we found ourselves back in that cold, oppressive courtroom. The air was thick with tension. I could feel Mitchell's smug confidence radiating from across the room. He thought he had me cornered. He thought this was his big payday, the culmination of 5 years of careful planning. He had no idea what was coming. After Arthur Finch laid out their greedy demands, after the words "half of all marital assets and substantial inheritance" hung in the air like a foul odor, Judge Albright turned her piercing gaze on me. Her expression was unreadable, a blank slate of judicial neutrality. "Mrs. Pierce," she said, her voice calm but commanding. "Do you have any response to these claims?" This was it. The moment of truth. My heart hammered against my ribs, but a strange sense of calm washed over me. I had the truth on my side. And I had a secret weapon tucked away in my purse. I stood up, my movements slow and deliberate. Every eye in the courtroom was on me. I could feel the reporters lean in, their pens poised. Mitchell watched me, a small, condescending smile playing on his lips. He probably thought I was about to break down, to plead, to make a scene. "Yes, Your Honor," I said, my voice ringing out clear and steady, surprising even myself with its strength. "I do have a response. But before I say anything, I believe there's something the court needs to see." I walked from the defendant's table toward the judge's bench. The only sound in the room was the soft click of my heels on the marble floor. I reached into my purse and withdrew the large, manila envelope that Susan had prepared for this exact moment. It felt heavy in my hand, heavy with the weight of justice. Mitchell's confident expression faltered slightly. A flicker of confusion crossed his face. He whispered something to his lawyer, who just shrugged, looking equally perplexed. They had no idea. They had been so consumed by their own scheme, so blinded by their greed, that they had overlooked the single most important detail of our entire relationship. I held the envelope out to the court clerk, who then passed it up to the judge. "Your Honor," I said, making sure to look directly at Mitchell as I spoke. I believe the court needs to review this document before we proceed with any discussions about asset division. Judge Albright extended her hand and accepted the envelope. She examined it for a moment before looking at me over the top of her reading glasses. What is the nature of this document, Mrs. Pierce? I took a deep breath. I let my eyes meet Mitchell's one last time, wanting to see his face in the exact moment his world began to crumble. It's a prenuptial agreement, Your Honor, I announced. One that my husband signed before our marriage 5 years ago. The change in the courtroom atmosphere was immediate and electric. It was like a lightning strike. A collective gasp rippled through the spectators. Mitchell's lawyer, Arthur Finch, shot up from his chair as if he'd been stung by a wasp. Mitchell's face went from confident to confused to something approaching pure, unadulterated panic in the span of 30 seconds. The game had just changed. And they were on the losing side. The silence that followed my announcement was deafening. Then, chaos erupted. Your Honor, we were not made aware of any prenuptial agreement. Arthur Finch exclaimed, his voice suddenly shrill and panicked. This is highly irregular. We object. Sit down, Mr. Finch, Judge Albright commanded, her voice cutting through the courtroom like a whip. She didn't even look up at him. She was already breaking the seal on the envelope, her focus entirely on the documents within. I will examine these documents and determine their validity. You will have your turn. I returned to my seat, keeping my eyes locked on Mitchell. His face was a canvas of crumbling confidence. He was whispering frantically to his attorney, gesturing wildly toward the judge's bench. I couldn't hear everything, but I could make out fragments of his urgent, panicked words. She never mentioned, how is this possible? Beside me, Susan Vance remained perfectly calm. She gave my hand a reassuring squeeze under the table. She'd been preparing for this moment for months, ensuring every detail of our strategy was foolproof. Just watch, she whispered to me, a small, satisfied smile on her face. Judge Albright was a thorough reader. She took her time, her eyes scanning each page of the agreement with meticulous care. The minutes stretched on, feeling like hours. The entire courtroom was held in suspense, watching the judge read the document that held Mitchell's multi-million-dollar fantasy in the balance. The document was comprehensive. A masterpiece of legal protection. Susan had made sure of that 5 years ago. It outlined exactly which assets were protected, which debts would remain separate, and most importantly, it had an entire section, ironclad and unambiguous, detailing how any future inheritance would be handled. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Judge Albright looked up. She removed her glasses and placed them deliberately on the bench. This appears to be a properly executed prenuptial agreement, she announced, her voice carrying clearly through the silent room. It is dated 6 weeks before your marriage, witnessed by 2 notaries public, and signed by both parties. Arthur Finch looked like he wanted the floor to open up and swallow him whole. I realized in that moment that the man had committed a cardinal sin of his profession. He had filed this massive divorce case without doing the most basic due diligence. He'd assumed, just like his greedy client, that this was a straightforward asset grab. He had been completely and utterly blindsided. Your Honor! Mitchell suddenly stood up, his voice cracking slightly. His carefully constructed facade was shattering. I need to see that document. I don't remember signing anything like that. Judge Albright's eyebrows rose at his outburst. Mr. Pierce, please remain seated and allow your attorney to handle these proceedings. This is not a town hall meeting. But Mitchell was spiraling now, his confidence completely gone, replaced by a desperate panic. He turned to me, his eyes wide. Carolyn, what is this? You never told me this was some kind of legal trap. Mr. Pierce. Judge Albright's voice was sharp as glass now. You will remain silent, or I will hold you in contempt of court. Your attorney may request to review the document through the proper channels. Arthur Finch approached the bench with obvious reluctance, like a man walking to his own execution. I watched him examine the prenuptial agreement, his face growing paler with each page he turned. He returned to his table and began whispering urgently to Mitchell, who was just shaking his head in disbelief, his mouth hanging open. The courtroom spectators were now fully engaged, buzzing with muffled conversations. I could hear the furious scratching of reporters' pens as they tried to capture every delicious detail of Mitchell's public humiliation. This was better than any soap opera. This was real life. And my cheating, conniving husband was the star of the show. Your Honor, Arthur Finch finally addressed the court again, his voice notably lacking its earlier confidence. It was thin, reedy. My client would like to request a brief recess to review these new documents more thoroughly. Judge Albright checked her watch, her expression one of clear annoyance. Mr. Finch, did you not conduct discovery regarding potential prenuptial agreements before filing these extensive asset claims against Mrs. Pierce? The attorney's silence was answer enough. He just stood there, shifting his weight from foot to foot. Mitchell had been so arrogant, so sure of his watertight plan to fleece me, that he'd never even mentioned the possibility of a prenup to his own lawyer. He'd probably forgotten all about it, dismissing it as the romantic formality he'd once called it. Mr. Finch had been blindsided just as much as his client. I will give you 10 minutes, Judge Albright declared, her tone leaving no room for negotiation. But I should warn you, Mr. Finch, this appears to be a legally binding agreement that significantly, and perhaps fatally, impacts your client's claims. During the recess, I watched them from across the room. Mitchell and his lawyer were huddled in an intense, frantic conversation near the courtroom windows. Mitchell's gestures became more and more animated, more desperate, as Arthur Finch presumably explained the grim implications of the document he'd signed so casually 5 years ago. Even from a distance, I could pinpoint the exact moment when the full reality of the situation hit him. His shoulders slumped, his head fell into his hands. His multi-million-dollar payday had just vanished into thin air. His plan was completely, utterly backfired. Susan used the time to review her own notes. He's going to claim fraud or duress, she predicted quietly, not even looking up. Men like Mitchell never blame themselves when their schemes fall apart. It's always someone else's fault. And she was right. When court resumed, Arthur Finch immediately launched into a desperate, last-ditch legal argument. Your Honor, my client believes he was deceived about the nature of this document, he began, his voice straining. Mrs. Pierce presented it to him as a romantic formality, not a comprehensive asset protection agreement. He was misled. Judge Albright looked distinctly unimpressed. Mr. Finch, are you claiming your client, an educated man and a business professional, signed a legal document without reading it? Your Honor, my client trusted his wife, Finch pleaded. He believed she was being honest about the document's scope and its implications. I had to bite my tongue to keep from laughing out loud. Mitchell, who had always prided himself on being a shrewd businessman, a man who could read people and situations, was now having his lawyer argue that he was too trusting and naive to understand a basic legal contract. The irony was almost too much to bear. The document is clearly labeled prenuptial agreement on every single page, is it not? Judge Albright observed, flipping through the pages in her hand. It also includes standard warnings about seeking independent legal counsel. Did your client choose to waive that right, Mr. Finch? Arthur shuffled through his papers nervously. Yes, Your Honor. My client waived his right to independent counsel. And the document was reviewed and signed in the presence of a notary public, correct? With your client present and confirming his identity? Yes, Your Honor. The judge then turned her attention directly to my husband. The predator was now the prey. Mr. Pierce, she asked, her voice dangerously quiet. When you signed this document, did anyone force you to do so? Were you under any kind of duress or coercion? Mitchell's face was red with a mixture of embarrassment and rage. No, Your Honor, he mumbled, refusing to look at her. But I thought it was just paperwork. Carolyn made it sound like it didn't matter. Did you read the document before signing it, Mr. Pierce? The question hung in the air like a sword. Mitchell looked around the courtroom as if he was searching for an escape route. The silence stretched on, becoming more and more uncomfortable for everyone present. Mr. Pierce, the judge prompted, her voice firm. I asked you a direct question. I skimmed it, Mitchell finally admitted, his voice barely a whisper. But she said it was just a formality. Judge Albright's expression was a masterpiece of judicial disapproval. Mr. Pierce, you signed a legal document without reading it, after waiving your right to legal counsel, and now you are asking this court to invalidate it because you didn't take it seriously? Is that the summary of your position? The courtroom was completely silent. He had no answer. His trap had not only failed, but it had snapped shut on his own leg. Arthur Finch made one final, desperate attempt to salvage something from the wreckage of his case. Your Honor, perhaps we could argue that the agreement is unconscionable, given the disparity in... Mr. Finch, Judge Albright interrupted, her patience clearly worn thin. Have you reviewed the financial disclosures that were included as an appendix to this prenuptial agreement? Finch flipped through the document again, clearly searching for something he had missed in his panicked review. There are extensive financial disclosures here, Your Honor. Indeed, there are, the judge confirmed. Mrs. Pierce provided complete documentation of her assets, her income, and her expected inheritance from her grandmother's estate. Your client signed acknowledgments confirming that he had reviewed and understood all of this financial information prior to the marriage. Frankly, Mr. Finch, this is one of the most thorough and fair prenuptial agreements I have seen in my 23 years on the bench. Mitchell looked like he was about to be physically sick. The golden boy, the charming manipulator who had charmed his way through life, was finally facing real consequences for his actions. There were no more lies to tell, no more people to fool. There was only the black and white text of a contract he had been too arrogant to read. Judge Albright cleared her throat and began reading directly from the agreement, her voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom, each word a nail in the coffin of Mitchell's scheme. Section 4, Paragraph A, all assets owned by either party prior to the marriage shall remain the separate property of that party. Section 4, Paragraph B, any inheritance received by either party during the marriage shall be considered separate property and shall not be subject to division upon divorce. Mitchell's face went through a spectrum of colors, red, then white, then a pale, sickly green. He gripped the edge of his table so hard his knuckles were bone-white. That can't be legal, he muttered, loud enough for several people in the front rows to hear. Section 6, Judge Albright continued, ignoring him, addresses spousal support. Quote, neither party shall be entitled to alimony or spousal support from the other, regardless of the length of the marriage or the disparity in income. This section, she added, looking up, was initialed by both parties and witnessed separately. I stood up. Your Honor, if I may? Proceed, Mrs. Pierce. When I received my grandmother's inheritance 18 months into our marriage, I explained, I immediately consulted with my attorney, Susan Vance. We confirmed that the inheritance was fully protected under Section 4, Paragraph B. The funds have been kept in separate accounts and have never once been commingled with marital assets. I maintain my regular salary from my business for all household expenses. This was the final nail. Not only was the prenup ironclad, but I had scrupulously followed the rules to keep the inheritance separate. There was no loophole, no gray area for him to exploit. Mitchell exploded. That's not true, he shouted, jumping to his feet. She bought things for us. She paid for vacations. Mr. Pierce. Judge Albright's voice was ice cold. You are out of order. Sit down immediately. But he was beyond reason now, his carefully constructed facade completely crumbled, revealing the greedy, entitled man-child beneath. This is insane. I've been with her for 5 years. I supported her emotionally. I gave up my career for her. You quit your job to spend my money, I said quietly, but my voice carried in the silent room. He spun on me, his face contorted with rage. She trapped me. She made me think we were partners. She let me believe that money was ours. Mr. Pierce, if you cannot control yourself, I will have the bailiff remove you from my courtroom, the judge threatened. The threat finally penetrated his rage. He sat down heavily, his chest heaving. But the damage was done. Everyone in the courtroom had seen his true character. Judge Albright put on her reading glasses one last time and delivered her decision. Mr. Pierce, this prenuptial agreement is valid, comprehensive, and legally binding. You are entitled to exactly nothing from your wife's premarital assets, her inheritance, or her business holdings. Nothing, he whispered, the word hollow. Nothing, Judge Albright confirmed. Furthermore, according to Section 7 of this agreement, all debts incurred individually by either party remain the responsibility of that party. Mrs. Pierce, do you have documentation of such debts? Susan handed me a thick folder, which I passed to the bailiff. Yes, Your Honor. Credit card debts, the loan for his car, the failed restaurant investment, and unpaid country club fees. It totals approximately $87,000. The judge's gaze was like ice. Mr. Pierce. Not only will you receive no assets from this marriage, but you remain personally responsible for the $87,000 in debt that you accumulated. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Bradley had gone from expecting millions to facing bankruptcy in the span of an hour. Your Honor, he pleaded, his voice barely audible. 5 years of my life has to count for something. Judge Albright's smile was razor-sharp. It does count for something, Mr. Pierce. It counts as an expensive lesson in reading legal documents before you sign them. She brought the gavel down with a finality that echoed through the room like thunder. This court is adjourned. And just like that, it was over. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by Mitchell's ragged breathing. He had lost. Pause, shift to a direct, intimate tone. If you're still listening to my story, could you do me a huge favor? Please like this video, and comment the number 1 down below. It lets me know you've given me a thumbs up and that you've been on this journey with me. Your support is a massive encouragement for me. Please, comment the number 1, and let me tell you what happened next. In the months following our divorce, Mitchell's life unraveled in the most spectacular, and frankly, satisfying way. Poetic justice, it turns out, isn't just something you read about in books. The $87,000 in debt was an anchor that dragged him down immediately. It forced him into bankruptcy within 6 months, completely destroying his credit. The man who prided himself on his image and connections could no longer even get a credit card. His reputation in Nashville's tight-knit business community was ruined. The story of how he tried to steal his wife's inheritance after signing a prenup he didn't read became a local legend, a cautionary tale told over drinks at the very country club he was no longer a member of. Speaking of which, the club revoked his membership when he couldn't pay his dues. The luxury car he claimed was for networking was repossessed in the middle of the night, leaving him dependent on public transportation. It turned out that without my money to prop him up, his lifestyle was completely unsustainable. His dating life, which I'm sure he thought would be full of wealthy widows and divorcees, became non-existent. The women in our social circles are smart. Word spread like wildfire, and they warned each other about the charming man who viewed marriage as a business transaction. He was branded a known gold digger. The last I heard, he was forced to move back in with his elderly parents in Memphis. He had to take an entry-level sales job, starting over at 47 with nothing but crushing debt and a reputation that was damaged beyond repair. His grand dreams of living off my grandmother's money had been replaced by the harsh reality of his own making. As for me, the moment the divorce was final, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders that I didn't even realize I had been carrying for 5 years. I felt lighter, freer than I had in a decade. I took a portion of my protected inheritance, my grandmother's legacy, and used it to establish the Pierce Foundation. Our mission is to provide legal assistance and grants to women seeking prenuptial agreements and affordable divorce representation. I wanted to ensure that other women wouldn't fall victim to financial predators like Mitchell. I wanted to turn my painful experience into a shield for someone else. Looking back on my journey, from a trusting, lonely wife to an empowered divorcee, I realized that my grandmother's wisdom had saved me from more than just financial loss. Her insistence on protecting family wealth, and Susan's insistence on that ironclad prenup, had saved me from a lifetime of being used, of being seen as nothing more than a bank account. It saved me from a man who saw my love not as a gift, but as a pathway to easy money. The nightmare was finally over. The truth was out. And as I walked out of that courtroom, leaving Mitchell to collapse in the ruins of his own greed, I wasn't looking back. I was looking forward, to a future that was entirely my own, built on a foundation of strength, resilience, and the enduring legacy of a very wise woman. Thank you so much for listening to my story. It means the world to me to be able to share it. I have a question for all of you. Have you ever had a moment in your life where you had to stand up and fight for what was rightfully yours? I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. And if you found yourself rooting for me, please don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more stories. I'll see you in the next one.